morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for tuning into this session. This is updates to Power BI composite models. I'm Jeroen ter Heerdt, or Jay for people that don't speak Dutch, like the majority of the world. I'm a program manager at Microsoft on Power BI. And today I want to talk about what we're doing and changing about composite models. And as you might know, Power BI already shipped composite models. Right? It already exists. However, there are a couple of things that are limitations and things that we would like to change about the product and about the feature of composite models that we'll talk about today. I'll also give a demo, fingers crossed if that will work, but then you can also see the feature in action, and we can talk about how that integrates with other features that we already have inside of Power BI. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So first off, I want to talk about real quickly about Power BI, and I'll go quickly through this slide. I don't expect to have to spend a lot of time on this. So Power BI is really about all data, right? We built this suite of products and a suite of tools actually to help you analyze any data, big, small, any data inside of your organization or even in your personal life. And it's really for everyone. So you can use this for yourself, for your immediate work area, for your team, for your whole organization, any level management or individuals, individual contributors can use this. As I said, I already used this in my personal life as well on a couple occasions. So there's really no stopping you to take any data, anything that you can analyze using data and plug it into Power BI to get insights. And really that brings us to the last factor here is we try to build these tools for you to make every decision that you might make. So basically for all data, for everyone, for every decision. And that kind of drives the data culture that we try to build with Power BI in your organization and in your companies. But even also in your personal lives. Data is all around us. There's a lot of data that you can use and analyze all and help to make better decisions. So that's what we're here for. Now, if we start thinking about Power BI, there's a couple of tools, right? There's PowerBI.com, there's the Power BI desktop, you have Power BI on mobile, you have Power BI on HoloLens. So there's a whole lot of, the whole spectrum of tools, essentially. So today, we'll talk about Power BI desktop mostly, and we'll talk about composite models. Now, if you already worked with Power BI desktop and Power BI in general, you might know and might think like, wait, composite models already exist, right? They are already there. Well, it's true. You would be right. However, there's a couple limitations around composite models, and we'll talk about those. And we'll talk about what we're going to do to enable more scenarios around composite models in the near future. But before we do that, before we start talking about technology, let's dive into a little story and just humor me for a couple minutes. Okay? Let's talk about what I like to call a tale of two kingdoms. Because essentially, the tale that I'm going to tell you is basically the translation of what's happening in every business around the world. And it makes it very clear that there is room for growth for this feature called composite models. Okay, so again, humor me for a little bit. We're gonna take a sidestep into a little tale here. So first of all, welcome to Venezuela. You are the analyst for the country of Venezuela. Your job is to analyze information, come up with insights that help the Queen of Venezuela to make great decisions. And those decisions are life-threatening sometimes. They're very important to the country. It's about the future of the country. There's not small decisions. These are big decisions. And your job is to take data left and right, mash them up, and come up with new value and new insight that you can provide to the Queen so she can base her decision on your insights. And you're happy doing that, right? You take data from Excel, you take data from a CSV, you take data from a SQL database, from somewhere outside of the country, you just download something, you mash it up together, and that's it. That's the magic you create. That's the value you add to the organization, and your Queen is happy. And you happen to use Power BI for that. And Power BI can do this. Power BI can help you bring that Excel and that CSV and that SQL together, that external data, and mesh it up, right? It enables you to do that. So life is great, right? I mean, you're doing good. Everybody's happy. Queen is happy. You're able to do everything you want to do in terms of mashing up the data. So life is great, right? Well, now, one day, you get called into the office of the Queen. And she says, you know, I really appreciate you. You do a lot of great work for us. You know, the analysis, the information, the insight you provide really helps me base my decisions on trustworthy data. So I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate your work. And that's why I have a special assignment for you. I want you to go to a neighboring country, because in that neighboring country, they do things slightly differently. And I'm considering entering into a trade agreement with them because I see, you know, benefit on both sides. But I need you to go there and analyze their data, mesh it up with our data, so that we can really understand what's going on and understand if this is going to be a wise decision to come into a trade agreement with them. So she essentially sends you to the neighboring country, and that's IT-Stan. And the moment you cross the border into IT-Stan, you notice it works differently. It is not the same open, flexible environment as Venezuela, where you come from, has. It is different. They have different rules. Data is stored differently. It is stored maybe in paper files from IT-controlled systems where rules and regulations are very strict. And the data, they almost guard it as a secret. The regulations and rules are very different. They don't want you to just download the data and take it and mash it up with that Excel and that SQL like you've been doing all the time in Venezuela. They don't want you to do that because they're afraid to lose track of where it went and how the data was used. The stakes might be higher, it's a bigger country, but still. Is the data so sensitive that we need to treat it differently? So these questions pop up in your mind, and really what happens, you hit this big wall, because on the one side, you have Venezuela, where you know you can do what you want. You can mesh up all the data, you have your queen, she needs the insight, and now you're on the other side of the wall. And on the other side of the wall, you simply cannot do what you were asked to do. And there's no way for you to bridge that wall somehow or jump that wall. So now what? What do you do? How do you even approach this? How do you even solve for this? How do you even come up with an answer for your queen before you return back to Venezuela? Now, and this is what we're going to talk about. What is a lifeline that we can throw people from the Power BI team and to improve Power BI on, that will help them deal with this situation? Because this situation happens all the time, right? On one side, there's business, or Venezuela in my story. And on the other side, there's IT, or IT-Stan, as I called them. And those two little kingdoms, if you will, in an organization, don't necessarily match. The experience is different. The rules are different. The things you can do and the things you cannot do are different. And we know that a lot of business analysts that use Power BI sit somewhere in between those two environments, and they find themselves jumping through hoops to bridge those gaps. And that's what we're trying to improve. That's the situation we're trying to improve. We're trying to enable those business analysts to take the data from Venezuela and from the business and the data from IT and mash them up like they can do with any business data that they're used to doing. Okay, end of the story. Back to the normal slides. Let's talk about the composite models. Let's talk about what composite models really are today and what they will be in the future. And I say tomorrow here, but that should really be in quotes, right? I mean, I'm not saying this will be released tomorrow. Okay, composite models today. And if you've used Power BI before, you might think that we already have composite models, right? And yes, you'll be right. We do. What do composite models do? They allow you to take any data from import sources like an Excel file or a SQL database, and take some data from a direct query source like another SQL database and mash them up into one data model, right? Power BI can do this. It's perfectly fine to build a data model on top of more than one source, where the source might come from import or direct query or a combination of those. Doesn't really matter. And you can do this today. And people have been doing this since whenever this was released, and this has been a great functionality, because before that you could only build reports on top of one data set. So really, this is great. It's already there. However, there are a couple limitations around composite models. And it so happens that the sources that don't really work with composite models today are typical IT sources, right? So the moment you connect to any of these sources that are now on the slide, SAP HANA, SAP BW, Business Warehouse, SQL Server Analysis Services, Power BI datasets, or Azure Analysis Services, you cannot use composite models. So if you connect to any of these live, which means the data stays where it is, you will see that Power BI will not allow you to go back to the Get Data screen to add more data to this model. You'll be limited to just the data that's inside of this, the data set, the source that you used, which can still be great for whatever you need to do. However, it's very hard to mesh this data up with something else. And as it happens, doing this connection to these sources in import mode, where you actually take the data over into Power BI, is mostly impossible, because these sources happen to be large data sets. There's a lot of data stored in here, and taking that into Power BI Desktop and wrestling into that local environment that you have in Power BI Desktop, that's almost impossible in many cases. So that's really not an answer either. So today, if you connect to these typical IT sources, you cannot do a composite model. And this is what happens in our story. In IT, they use SQL Server Analysis Services, they use Azure Analysis Services, they use Power BI datasets. And then the moment you want to mesh that up with an Excel or a CSV or external data using Power BI, that becomes really hard or even impossible. So now let's talk about the Composite Models Tomorrow version. And again, I'm not saying it will be released tomorrow. I don't even know when you're actually watching this video. So for a given value of tomorrow, quote unquote, right? Near future. So essentially what we're saying is, if data is stored in this enterprise semantic model, where really IT controls what's happening, this is a tightly controlled, secure environment where data is stored in massive data sets, and that is versioned, right? It goes through the development, test, acceptance, production steps of like real enterprise scenarios, right? So this is your Azure Analysis Service environment or a Power BI data set. And now today what you can do is you can connect to it. However, that's the only thing you can do. You can connect to it, you can report on it, but making changes, there's nothing you can do. Extending it with other data sets, there's nothing you can do. Now, this is what we're going to change. So in the Composite Models Tomorrow version, you'll be able to still connect to this enterprise semantic model, that Azure Analysis Services environment, for example. And you'll be able to not only read the data from it and report on it, but you can also add more data sets. And you can also make changes about that data set in your analysis. And then you can share that analysis, that little circle here on the slide, back to the Power BI service, and then somebody else can come in and say, you know what, that's a great solution. It extends the enterprise semantic model with something that I needed. It's not entirely there, so I'll take that solution, the one you build, and extend it further. So you can imagine a chain of models are coming to existence, right? Where you will see the semantic model being the source, and then local model 1, another version, like a chain of models being dependent on each other. So to say that differently, the Composite Models Tomorrow version would allow you, in addition to the current Composite Models capabilities, to connect to Azure Analysis Services and Power BI datasets and still use the Composite Models feature. And remember, today you can't do that. So when we say Azure Analysis Services and Power BI datasets and still using the Composite Models feature, what we mean, you will be able to extend data that is in either of those models, which means adding more data sets, mashing them up with something else, and you can personalize them. So there's two different things here, right? So extending actually means the data set is great, however, a little piece that I need is missing from it. So you connect to your IT-controlled Azure Analysis Services environment, and it has the finance perspective on your organization. However, it's missing the sales perspective. And you know that's somewhere else outside of this Azure Analysis Service environment. And really with this Composite Model Tomorrow version, you'll be able to mash them up and combine them together. That's what we call extend. Now, personalize is slightly different. Personalize is where the scope of the data that you need is fine. It's already there in the data source. However, the way it's maybe formatted or the way it's being calculated is something that you would like to change about that. So, typical example might be your Azure Analysis Service environment was built by an IT person in the US, and they used the date format for the sales date that made sense to them, which is month, day, year. However, if you're from Europe like me, that doesn't really make sense because, you know, we're used to day, month, year format, right? November 19th, 2020 would be the American format. It would be 19th November of 2020 in the European format, right? So 11/19/2020 or 19/11/2020. So what you can do is you can take that IT Azure Analysis Services environment that has this US-based date format string, and then for your report, you can change that format string and say, no, it's not going to be month, day, year, it's going to be day, month, year. Because that makes sense for me, it makes sense for my audience that I'm building this report for, and that's really the kind of thing that we're thinking about when we say personalize. Making those format string changes, adding a measure, adding a calculated column, renaming a measure, a table, or a column, changing properties such as the format string example I just gave you. So all of those will be in the personalized category. So even with this tomorrow version, there will be a couple limitations. We cannot boil the ocean, right? So there's more things that we need to do, but we're taking a step in the right direction. And so even with the tomorrow version, there will be limitations where you will not be able to use this Composite Models feature against SAP HANA and SAP BW, the business warehouse. So if you use either of those two sources, I'm sorry, you'll still be in the same boat as you are today. You will still be able to report on those, but you won't be able to personalize and extend those sources. If you use SQL Server Analysis Services multidimensional, the same applies. Now for SQL Server Analysis Services tabular, if you use those, you will need to wait to the engine upgrade for SQL Server before this would be available to you. If you use Power BI datasets or Azure Analysis Services, those people, that's what we're really targeting here. And you'll see that the documentation, basically Power BI datasets and Azure Analysis Services will disappear from the list of sources that have limitations, right? You will be able to connect to a Power BI datasets or an Azure Analysis Services environment and just use the Composite Models feature to its fullest extent, extending and personalization. Okay, so with that, let's jump into a demo. Okay, so here we are in Power BI Desktop, and the first thing I'll do is I'll connect to a Power BI dataset. So I go to Get Data, and I choose Power BI Datasets. And what I can do is I can enter the name of the dataset that I want to connect to, which is AdventureWorks DW 2020. I'm just going to connect to that. And what will happen now is we'll now have a live connection to this model, right? So previously you wouldn't see the model view here, but we've changed that in June, that you can now see the model view for a live connection. That was actually a step up to this new updated version of Composite models. Now, one of the things that you can do here that you might have noticed in recent releases is you can actually upgrade the model view to a newer view, a newer design, where this might sound a bit weird, but it's not. It might not be very useful if you just have one source. But the moment we start diving into the actual updated composite models feature, you'll see where this starts making sense, and I'll get back to this view in a second. Okay, so let's continue. As you can see, the get data is now still available. So with the version that's already out there, this get data functionality wouldn't be available because I'm already connected live to a data source. I cannot add any more, but now I can. So I can go back to get data. I can do, for example, let's do SQL Server. And now Power BI says, hey, in order for you to do this, we will need to move your live connection to a direct query connection. And this essentially means we are going to create this local copy of a model. So we're going to create the local model in Power BI Desktop so we can track the fact that you have multiple sources, and we can allow you to extend them, mesh them up, and also make the personalizations. All of that is going to be captured in this local model. So basically this says, do you want a local model? If you choose cancel, you will not be able to add, nothing will happen. If you do add a local model, then we'll continue, as I'm doing now, with connecting to the extra source. So I chose SQL. And what we're doing now is we're just changing the connection to a direct query connection to AS. And as you can see, the storage mode has changed, right? We're now in direct query mode. Previously, that said live to the AdventureWorks dataset. Now we're in direct query. So that shows that even the connection that I currently have, which is the connection to my Power BI dataset, is already in direct query with a local model. Okay, so now I can add a new connection to, let's say, SQL Server database, right? And I'm going to do that in direct query mode. So I'm effectively adding another direct query connection to my model. And I'll go to the AdventureWorks DW bike sales, and I want the bike sales and the country. So those two tables I'll load to my model. Now, what happens here, it says this is a potential security risk because there might be data, query data going over the line from one source to the other the moment I start meshing them up. Because, imagine we build a relationship between these two, let's say on product name, well, then the product names from my original live source might be sent as a filter to the second source or the other way around, depending on how I set up my relationship. And we're just telling you that you need to be aware of that. Now, of course, you should only do this whenever you trust both sources, the owners and the admins with the data, that's all fine. So if you want to build this model, click OK. And now we're adding the second direct query source. So as you can see, bike sales and country has been added here to the list. And if I go now to the model view, you'll see where the model view starts, the new capability we have in the model view start making more sense because you'll see that the bike sales and country that I just loaded from the other source has been, they have a different color. They have a different, this is black, that is blue. So that's basically what we call a different island. And you can also hover over it and you can see where it came from. You can see the server, the data source type, the storage mode, the database, right? And you can do the same for this as well, right? You can see that there's a direct query source here by the icon. So we're making it very clear where the data came from and that it was a different island, which is a different data source where it effectively came from, right? All of these black tables from one, the blue tables from another. Are we done? Well, I mean, no, I can just to prove a point, I can go a little bit further and I can say, you know what? I do have two direct query sources now, one Power BI data set, one SQL Server. Let me go add an Excel, right? So I'll start importing just a simple Excel sheet that lists our targets for a certain sales region, sales territory. So I click this Excel sheet, and Excel is, of course, only in import mode. So I'll do load of the targets. So now what we're doing is we're loading the Excel data into our local model, right? And so now our local model contains the Excel data, or it will be in a couple of seconds now. It will contain it. And two pointers to two data sets, right? Two direct query sources, one SQL, one Power BI data set. So you'll see another table being added here, which is our third island of one table, but still an island. And that's the targets, right? So if I zoom in now, I can see that, this is a separate one with a different storage mode because it's imported, so it's a different icon. And you now also see that the data view is now enabled because suddenly there's now a table that needs a data view where we can do stuff with the data because the others are still only direct query, right? So what I can do is I can, for example, go and say, you know what? I'll say this is actually a decimal number. Yes, I want to do this data type change. And of course, I could have done this in Power Query, but just for simplicity of the demo and not showing you too many screens, I'm doing this here. But you could do that in Power Query as well as whatever you prefer. So I'm now just marking the target as currencies in dollars. Okay. So what can I do now? Well, this is all great that we can import separate sources, but what if I wanted to really build a relationship between the two sources, because the targets are here for a reason, right? We have a sales territory table over here. So I just want to build a relationship between these two sources, region to region. And then, of course, the familiar relationship dialog pops up and asks me, where do you want to run the relationship? It's one-to-one because we have one target for each region. That makes sense because it's only for 2020. And here we go. So now I build a relationship between two islands, one import and one direct query. So I can now start using that information in a visual. I can go region, and I can ask for the sales amount. That's the sales amount for all of the years. So I can change that to say, I only want this for fiscal year 2020, for example. And then I want the targets. Sorry. There we go, dropping it in the right location. So now I have the targets and the sales amount for 2020 next to each other, right? Great. What can I do? Well, of course, this is already great. I can have a visual where I have both of the data sources, two of the islands actually showing in one visual, right? I can add a new measure. I could, for example, do variance to target. And that's the sum of the total sales amount. The sum of the sales amount minus the sum of the target. So what I calculated here is the variance to target, the sum of the sales amount minus the sum of the targets. Let me zoom in a little bit here so you can read this a bit better. So that's essentially a very simple subtraction of the sales amount and the targets. And now I can use that in, of course, my visual, right? So I can drag this as any measure, can drag this to my visual. And now I have the variance to target. And of course I can do all interesting things. I'm not a great report designer, but I could, for example, do conditional formatting and use that to, highlight where we are closer to target and where we are, further away from target. So essentially, this is my shiny composite model, right? I was able to take data from my Power BI data set. I was able then to elevate this to a composite model by adding another data set, which was a direct query to SQL Server. And that turned my live connection to my Power BI data set into a direct query connection. And now, after that, I was able to add an import source, build a relationship, and add a measure and show them in the same visual. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so as we've seen, we can now use the Composite Models updated version to connect to Power BI datasets, add a SQL Server, and even import an Excel sheet and then mash it all up, creating measures and building a visual. Now let's talk about how this actually works. Okay, so the way this works. What happens here is that if you have a live connection to a data source, let's say a Power BI data set, by default, there's no local model in Power BI. So there's really no place for Power BI and Power BI Desktop to store any changes that you make, like, for example, adding a measure. That needs to be stored somewhere. So what we do is the moment you connect to a live, like a live source, what I did with the Power BI data set, and then add the SQL source, SQL Server to it or any other, we'll ask you if you want to create a local model. And you need that because there's no other way for us to store the relationship between the two sources you just mashed up or any changes that you make, like the measure. So that's actually what's happening. If you connect to the second source, we'll ask you, have you seen in the demo, like, do you want a local model? And you should say, yes, I want a local model, because that's essentially what we need for this whole Composite Model updated version to work. Okay, so a local data model is the trick here. That is what you get. Now, that doesn't contain all the data from the enterprise semantic model. Remember, it's still a connection to that model. It's a direct query connection actually to that central model. So the data is still there. However, the local model contains a metadata copy of what is in the enterprise semantic model, like table names, column names, etc. So we can persist any changes on top of that. And then, of course, for any import source that you take and add to the local model, that data will actually get imported into the local model, right? So let's walk through a couple of examples. So here's a very simple example, scenario number 1, where there's actually no real composite model here. It's just connecting live to a central source such as Azure Analysis Services or Power BI dataset, connecting live to that, building your report, which means building a couple of visuals and then publishing it to Power BI service. And what you end up with is just a report that points to this Azure Analysis Services environment or Power BI dataset, right? Nothing special. This is all the current behavior. Now, what I can do is I can take that same live connection and then make a change to the data model. And if I make that change, let's say we rename a column, and I publish that, what happens? That change was applied to a local copy of the data model, right? Again, just a metadata. But when I publish, I'll get a report that points to this new data set, that local copy, and that points to the blue cube in the middle, right? So no data, but just a metadata, and it's just like a view or a filter on top of the central cube that we have there, like the Azure Analysis Services environment. Now, the moment I do the same thing, I connect live, and then I import something from an Excel sheet like I did in the demo, that data is stored in a local data model in Power BI Desktop. So when you publish, you end up with a data set that contains the data from the Excel and also still points to that, that central model that you connected to in step number 1. So I hope this kind of clarifies that the moment you start using composite models in this fashion, you end up with data sets and new reports, not just new reports, but also new data sets, depending on what you do, right? If you make an extension or you change anything, those things need to be persisted somewhere, and that's where the new data set comes in. And that's why it's important for you to know that when you roll out this feature to your users, you will see more data sets being created. And that's where we get into the enterprise capabilities, because we really need to talk about these capabilities, because as you can see in an enterprise, this becomes a situation that might be hard to manage, right? If people start using composite models in this updated version left and right, you will see more data sets coming in. You will see data sets being dependent on other data sets, because in the end, a composite model is just a Power BI data set. So I could publish one, and then you could take that one and extend it further and then publish that again. So you get a chain of data sets. So it becomes very important to keep track of how this data actually relates and how these data sets actually interact in your organization. And that's where the lineage view comes in. So the lineage view is already there, right? In the Power BI service, you can go to the lineage view. You'll see the relationship between data sources, data sets, and reports. Great. What we'll add is the ability for a data set to point to another, right? As you can see here in the slide, in the middle, the light blue boxes are two data sets that are related to each other. That's a scenario that doesn't exist today. But here, my budget and sales is actually a composite model that takes data from the enterprise semantic model called sales and adds in an Excel and meshes up together to create a report called sales and budget. So by looking at the lineage view, I'll be able to see that budget and sales takes data from Excel, takes data from sales, combines it, and creates the report sales and budget. And moreover, there might be other data sets dependent on me, right? So this is the upstream view, but I also need to know if there's anybody dependent on me. So what will happen is I can go to the impact analysis, and I'll see that from my budget and sales, there's actually a sales and budget Europe report data set, in the Europe reporting workspace that's dependent on me. So essentially, you can think of this as a chain with two hubs. Sales being the first, enterprise semantic model, my composite model, budget and sales, and then somebody else's composite model, sales and budget Europe. That takes my data set and potentially made changes or extended it. And this becomes very important because the moment I start updating my business and sales report and my data set, I need to know there's somebody dependent on me, because I might be breaking the chain, I might be making changes that impact them negatively. So when you update your data set from Power BI Desktop, you will see not only the number of reports, but also the number of data sets that you impact. And that's important. And you can here then go to that impact analysis view that I just showed you. So this is how we enable you to view the composite models and the relationships in the chain in your enterprise. Now there's another setting, and there's another setting that will allow you to discourage chaining on a composite model. And that basically means that at some point you might want to force the chain to stop, right? You might want to stop people from building another composite model on this composite model. So let's say this budget and sales composite model that I have here, right? Let's say that is the one, and you don't want anybody else to extend this further or personalize this further. It's okay to report on it, but you are not allowed to create new composite models on top of it. And that's something you'll be able to do. You'll be able to say on this data set, discourage chaining, which means you will not be able, using Power BI Desktop, to create a new composite model on top of this. You will still be able to connect to it and report on it, but you won't be able to extend it or personalize it. So that's another feature that we're bringing to help these enterprises move and analyze the data sets and understand how data flows through the organization. Now the other area of investment that we're doing and we're looking into at the moment is data protection, right? So data protection is a feature that you find in the service, and it also is finding its way to Power BI Desktop, where you can apply data set labels, right? You can label the data set as being medium business impact or high business impact, and anything that's not labeled is just general. Now, when you start using composite models and this data protection, it makes sense that if I use a highly confidential data set, that my composite model that I chained from this highly confidential data set takes the same level, right? The most restrictive label is applied to the composite model. So if I take one highly confidential and one unclassified, my composite model really should be highly confidential. And you will be able to add labels in Power BI Desktop, but you won't be able to remove labels. So if you take a highly confidential data set, you won't be able to suddenly say, well, because I combined it with another source, my composite model is suddenly no longer highly confidential. That won't be possible. So to put this visually, you can, for example, imagine 3 data sources: highly confidential at the top, medium business impact, and unclassified general, a workgroup Excel. Now, if I create just a report on top of a workgroup Excel, you will just see, that thing will be unclassified/general because, well, there's no classification here. Now, if I create a composite model that combines the departmental database, which is medium business impact, and the Excel, that dataset B will be medium business impact, right? The highest of the data protection labels. And now if I create a dataset C, where I combine data from my departmental database, which is medium business impact, and my enterprise semantic model, which is highly confidential, C will be highly confidential. Now, if I chain from C and B, which is completely fair, right? You can do that because those are just models, Power BI data sets. So I can take another data set, call it D, which combines data from C and B. Then D will be highly confidential, right? Because the highest label still applies. At no point I should be able to remove labels and suddenly call D less confidential than it actually is, because it's still combining highly confidential data with something else. That doesn't turn it into lower confidentiality. If anything, it should be on the same level and maybe higher. You will be able to set a higher level, but at least the level that it's currently at, which is highly confidential, is the one that will be there, and you will not be able to remove it. Okay, so with that, let's wrap it up, because we talked about a lot of things. We talked about the enterprise features that are coming. We talked about the changes that we're making to the composite models in the tomorrow, remember, tomorrow in quotes, a version. I showed you a demo. So let's step back to our story for just a couple of seconds, right? Remember the story that we started. We started with the business analyst in Business Suela and IT Istan. And really the problem they're seeing every day is that it's hard to bridge the gap between IT and business, right? The free world of business where you can mash up whatever, and the moment you start touching the IT sources, you run into walls where you cannot really jump across so easily and combine all that data and mash it up. And that's what we're changing with the composite models updated version. So life is good, right? Life is better now. You can do these things that the Queen asked of you. You will be able to mash up the data from IT Stan and your own Business Suela data. You are able to combine those and provide the insight that the Queen needs to decide on the trade agreement that was the big question that we started with. So hey, life is good, and as a good story ends, everybody lives happily ever after. Okay, so thanks for joining. Thanks for tuning into this session. Please keep the conversation going right now in the chat. I'll still be here in the chat for a little bit. Catch me in one of the networking areas during DPS. And also, outside of this immediate moment, please reach out to me. My contact details are here. Find me on Twitter. Send me a notification. Send me something on LinkedIn. I love to hear from you and gather your feedback. Also, ideas.powerbi.com is still a great way of getting your voice heard and voting on ideas, and help us really build the product that you need. And join the community at community.powerbi.com to show off your work and work with your fellow Power BI enthusiasts about and talk to them and share your knowledge and learn from them as well. And I know IDEA's website has not been perfect, but we're doing everything that we can to catch up on it. And, this is still the way for you to impact our decisions. So I hope this was useful. And thank you for joining. Thank you for tuning in. Please ask your questions. I'll still be around for a little bit. And otherwise, find me on social media or on email. Thanks a lot. Have a great rest of your day.